Good afternoon, dear friends. So Sanjyot asked me to share this session. I'm sure it will be really a nice one like this morning. So first of all, I would like to introduce Professor Ashurov, and we had lunch together and discussed so many things about his country, Tajikistan, and where I have been several times, and also about your studies in SOAS with Nicholas Sims Williams, who is a dear friend of mine. Your research is best categorized as cultural history with an interdisciplinary focus between history and culture, broadly conceived, including languages and religions of Central Asia, with emphasis on ancient Sogdian and its Iranian and Chinese geographical setting. I was talking to Martin in a while, and these are the things, Martin, you have started, and the young gentleman is continuing. Oh, yes, exactly. So this is wonderful to have you in the audience. So by way of methodology, he uses historiography and philological analysis to study material and textual sources evidence in order to put narratives together on various aspects of Sogdian civilization in its intermediate and extended cultural and political context. In addition, he has a great interest in exploring the continuity of ancient socio-cultural and historical trends into the modern period. This aspect of this research is reflected in his work in the sphere of ethnographic and documentary linguistics, focusing on engaged in Iranian languages of Tajikistan. It's my great pleasure to introduce you. Please welcome him. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the very kind introduction, and thank you for organizing this wonderful gathering. As it was mentioned, so my interest varies from modernity to medieval period, and something that I would be talking today would be also partially informed by the past, but it is something also temporary. Our knowledge of Sogdian civilization is primarily informed by the studies of the immensely rich material culture. And this includes also the textual and art heritage that were recovered both in Sogdiana heartland as well as in the regions where the Sogdian communities went and developed, such as the Chinese territories, or further in the beyond Sogdiana in the region of Semirechye, which is modern southern Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. The surviving material evidence and textual records, as we know it, thanks to the advance in Sogdian studies of the last half a century, present Sogdian society as a very ethno-religiously diverse society. And this, the evidence that is available now attests to existence of several religions among Sogdians, such as Zoroastrianism, Manichaeism that earlier this morning we heard about, as well as Christianity and Buddhism. My current research is on the social aspect of Sogdian society. My interest is on the social customs and social habits among the Sogdians. And this inquiry I take particularly through examining of the material culture, particularly material culture that bears religious connotation or other technological or ethnical association. My inquiry centers on the idea of space. This is the idea that I follow in my research, particularly about the production of space, role, and the use in connection of social interrelationships between different ethnic communities, and then if it is this different ethnic communities, then also religious communities. So what were these interrelationships? And for this purpose, I am very inspired, and I try to apply the ideas from Foucault, Lefebvre, and Soya about the space, which also in recent decades has been used widely in social archaeology and social material culture studies as well as social anthropology. Now, in contrast with the previous panel where they have presented a very beautifully established scholarship, what I am going to present, it is a work in progress. This is a research that I have started almost nearly a year ago, and it is still ongoing, but I'm very happy to present my preliminary and initial thinking because I would like to your feedbacks, and also I want to see how far I can take this topic. For definition of space here, for my research, I use the environmental science and social archaeology definition that defines it as the physical setting within which everything occurs and offering a wide-ranging possibilities and variations that tends to be understood as abstract, unlimited, universalizing, and continuous. And similarly, from material culture, I use the a very already long established definition that was given by about material culture to be all the things that people leave behind. As we look into the historical studies in Sogdiana, so it tends that so often we categorize the material evidence into a specific groups, like, oh, this is text, so we do it philological study. This is a wall mural, we do it artistic study. This is a ceramic, we do it this way. But I find this definition more accommodating and very broadly fitting with the idea that I have, as I consider that the material culture is anything that the Sogdians has left behind. And so in this relation, then space then can be seen as a dynamic, relational, and agentive arena that shapes ideas, beliefs, values that are intertwined with the lived experiences, and they touch every aspect of social, cultural, and religious life. Accordingly, space can have then different forms, attributes, and qualities comprising various products. And within the frame that I would look, so then one of the qualities of the space that I'm keen to see this, the idea of interconfessional and interethnic, and how this idea, this sociological idea, has been manifested in Sogdian material culture. And from this regard, then I want to show that the Sogdian material culture would not be only just material proof of existence of different religions, but they can be regarded as a distinctive form of spaces formed and produced in dialogical relationship, where these religions connected and shared these spaces. And these material things are spaces. And so I also go to, my idea is that when the space is also a thing, it is also material. It is not just only abstract, but it's a material. And in looking into material culture, as I said, I look into all the things that the Sogdians leave behind, but specifically for today, I would limit my talk only to material culture relevant to Buddhism that is found in Sogdiana or are related to Sogdians, as a small specimen to show how this works. And so for this, first we would just go, I want to show the material culture that we have on Buddhism. So we know that the material traces in Sogdiana is very limited. Comparing to the regions of Takharistan, Fargana, Semirechia, where Buddhism was very dominant, and we have the archaeological discoveries had found immense amount of material culture and architectural remains. In Sogdiana proper, in the valleys of the Zarafshan River, so none of these has been found. And if we believe that the Chinese pilgrims, Huanzhang's report or his Korean counterpart, they wrote about that they didn't find any traces of Buddhists, or they were chased, you know, they were persecuted. So it goes that probably Buddhism may have existed at some point, but probably by the 7th century it was completely already declined. And so then the material traces are very scarce. However, what is interesting that all the Buddhist Sogdian texts have been found in Chinese territory. That leads then some of the scholars like Xavier Tremblay as well as Yoshida that the Sogdian Buddhism is a colonial phenomenon, so that they went to the colonies and then converted. This was the idea that initially in 1999 was also expressed by Marshak, stating that the civic religious culture of Sogdiana didn't allow conversion. And so therefore, outside of their own home country, where they were not under the pressure of the civil religious authority of the country, so they were free to convert. Irrespective of what really motivated them to convert into Buddhism or not, what is significant that Buddhism coexisted within the Sogdian society along these Zoroastrian practices, and this is I find this more important to explore rather than the reasons that why they have converted and not. So far for Sogdian Buddhism, today we have, this is a very poorly preserved, so this is the only painted representation of Buddha that was found, this is a war mural found in Panjikent, and it was published by Marshak and Raspapova, where the composition presents a seated Buddha with a standing devotee depicted in his left side, dressed in an Indian garment and with a flower in his hand. And the composition was placed inside the arch drawn above the entrance door of the richly decorated with mural banquet hall. We will come back specifically to this mural painting later. But And there are obviously, I'm very aware about different criticisms that artistic features of this painted representation of Buddha from Panjikent has had. So as Marshak himself criticized, and there has been several other scholars who criticized, but we will, for a moment, we will not touch on that aspect of canonicity and representation of the Buddha. The next material evidence we have is this bronze statue, a gold-plated bronze statue of the Bodhisattva that was found in the site of Afrasiab. And it was found in the Derbis where they filled, and it was found in 1994. The stratigraphy of that place, which is also a joint area where is believed to be the first mosque in Afrasiab erected. So it comes from there. So they said it's probably from 10th century. And the Karayev, who published this, he said that this is probably to the 7th century and then was brought to Sogdiana probably, because this is the only specimen. The next Buddhist material culture that comes from Sogdiana directly is this terracotta icon of Buddha that was found in vicinity of Samarkand in 1990. And Kazim Abdullayev believes that this the Buddha figure here represent Tara Arya Tara. And the size of it was very small, so the functionality of this object is that probably it was a token that carried, or it was something that was probably attached to a thread and carried by the monks. And the next is another terracotta mold that was for casting a Buddhist figure, and this was found in Panjikent. And the story of it is that this is very interesting, that as the archaeological team revisited there's the area where they excavated 50 years ago. So this was found on that mound of the previous excavation. So since they have dug it out, so we don't know the stratigraphy of, but overall, because of we know the whole history of Panjikent, when it grew and when it declined, so it belongs to the 5th and 8th century, and certainly this terracotta mold, as well as previously what I showed about the terracotta icon, so they all have been scrutinized by art historians from the art history perspective, whether what elements here is, particularly on the positions of the hand of Buddha, his dressing, and etc., which I'm aware, but we won't go to that. And the most recent find of the Buddhist is from Panjaken that was discovered in 2017. And this is a carved wooden panel that, as we can see, so it was likely a little panel that was fitted above the door. And the similar things is also attested in other parts of Panjaken where such elements were placed above the door. Now, so this is all the things that we have, the material evidence that we have relevant to Buddhism from Sogdiana. So one of these, the painting and the carved panel comes directly from a dwelling house, which shows, shows its established social context. And the mold also would be connected to that productivity. So people use that for casting further Buddhist mold. And I don't know how much they have produced from this mold, how many Buddha icons they produced, since we have only one. But if we found this in 2017, I do believe that as the excavations, archaeological excavations are advancing, so there would be more to come. Now, as we would look into this material culture, and the text, obviously, I said, as I mentioned, that the texts all come from Chinese territory. The texts come from Dunhuang, the texts come from Turfan, and all of them are now dispersed across different countries. The Stein collection in British Library, Paleo collection in France, and Korotov collection in Russia, St. Petersburg, the Turfan in Berlin. But what is that? Some of these texts already have been studied and published, and it is ongoing. And as I first mentioned, so they also are part of the same parcel. Irrespective of that they were found separately, I consider them, they are part of this. They were, they were separated at some point of time, but certainly they belong to the same cultural movement, to the same social interactions that were taking place. And what one of the reasons to look into the material culture is that there is a lot of social in the material. Material culture ties people in society, and it provides means of sharing values and resources. It provides venue for technological exchange, as well as it provides relationship of producer and consumer. Some of the material culture can become their commodity, and they become commodified, and they're sold. So there are multiple layers of the social characteristics or social values that are in material culture that can help us to understand about social relations and how these social relations have developed and sustained. And when we look into this idea of the social in material, then we need to come to understanding that what does this material thing does, what does material objects do in the social context. And one idea that comes here is particularly through the Lefebvre, that it is that there are spaces that is produced in society and can be categorized into three levels. The first space is the physical space and perceived space. Then the second is mental space and conceived space. Then the third space is the social space and lived space. And as I look and try to understand and question about this pluralism in Sogdiana, as I look into the question that how did these religions coexist? We do not have certainly a text, a lot of evidence about war among these different religious groups in Sogdiana. We don't have that. We don't know, about the huge rivalries. We have only one polemical text, a Christian polemical text refuting Manichaeans. That's the only thing. We don't have, for instance, the text that they So this all leads to the idea that they were peacefully coexistent. So as I ask questions on this, so I look into this idea of the third space, that the material culture that we have from Sogdiana are markers, or they signify existence of this third space, which, given its religious connotations, I call it interconfessional. This is the third space where this different religiosity and religious could be together. And the space that we can, the space that we will talk, so one of the moments that is that I don't know how well this is seen, but one of the example of how this third space is displayed in the art, right? So we come here, remember this, but let us look here. So some of the arts of the murals of Penjikent that we know, so they depict stories from Panchatantra, the Indian stories, or they also have the stories coming from, from the Iranian tradition, from the Shahnameh, like the Rustam cycle, or like there are also a general secular scenes, like this a banquet, they're sitting and leisuring. So this is the theme. As you go into a Sogdian banquet hall in 7th century, you would see that so the entire walls are covered. So there are different layers of the art presented. And so this is reconstruction of the room where this Buddha icon was found. So if we look, so this is where the Buddha icon was, on the entrance of the door. So on the top side you can see this is the divinized representation of the head of the house. On the other side, then you see the divinity of the house, the god of the house, and then you have a Buddha on top of the door, and then the banquet, and then all other kind of social scenes. So when I look into this, and then I ask questions that, okay, do we take each panel of this art independently, isolated, and said, oh, this is the banquet, and certainly we can talk about it. Oh, look, this is a luxury vessels, like this gentleman holding this, Raitan, one of the, fascinating things that they use for drinking. Or do we talk about the morals of the stories, and this is from the Panchatantra, but if we look at it all together, what would be the interrelationship between the divine sitting, the divinized head of the house here, the god of this household over here, and the Buddha with the devotees here, and the other scenes here. So what is going on? I'm trying to, as this morning Rushana said about syntax, so I'm trying to also follow in that kind of, in reading the grammar of this art. What logic it is presenting, what kind of narrative it creates. And as I look, so what I can see that, so there, the primary reason of this, the art in this room was aesthetic space. This rich man, he wanted to create this aesthetic space where he would receive people who he deals, maybe his trade partners, etc., etc. But within that aesthetic space, then we find that, as the verse says, that the reproductivity of space. So within this aesthetic space that overall gives the mood that you come into a very beautifully decorated room, so then there is a space within this space. Then the images that you look, they are evocative. So people remember, they look, oh, I understand that. And so therefore, when I said about the criticism about the Buddha painting, Marshak poses several critical questions, which I agree. From art historical perspective, his judgment, I don't have any objection to that. As he says that, he mentions, says, neither the owner of the house nor the painter who painted this were Buddhist. They did not know at all what they are doing, what they are painting. But at the same time, he gives a lot of praise about the rest of the painting. So I'm assuming that probably if this was the same painter that painted the rest of the room, and he just did something here, and Marshak is very harsh criticizing him, then I pose question that, what if this was intentional? can we pose the question that there is intentionality in producing this? And one thing that I would say, for example, Marshak says that because of it is located over there was no enough space, so he couldn't even draw him standing or so. But we can see that his position is harmonized with the rest of the room. Everyone sitting with a cross leg. He's already in harmony. That Buddha is already in harmony with the rest of people sitting and feasting, and in that room. And at the same time, also as the position of this painting shows, so you just come in from there and you sit around. It is where you would see it all the time. You would sit there and you would know that, that this is the god of this house and this is the owner of the house. But this, and this Buddhist painting is recognizable. Yes, true that there is not the depiction of this Buddha. The depiction of this Buddha does not follow the strict norms or artistic norms that, as a Buddhist in the Buddhist art studies, people are accustomed to. But however, its presence there and being recognized, after many years of its discovery as a Buddhist, leads us to think that this Buddha was also recognized there. However, it had changed, whether the mudra was not correct, the closing was not correct, the size was not correct, whatever it was not correct, but this image was there with a purpose and it was producing. This art space, this room, it was a space, and this Buddha within that space is also producing another space, the space of harmony. One of my motivations, or one of my motivations in looking into this religious harmony and the emergence or existence of third space or safe spaces in multi-religious groups in ancient time is also informed by the fact that in modern societies there is a lot of conflicts going on. And so I also look into that how can we inform our students at universities, at school, by teaching that the lessons, the historical lessons from the past about these kind of places, the shared spaces of safe spaces, the spaces of interreligious or interconfessional spaces. I also want to see that these historical lessons that we can see in Sogdian, so it also would find parallel, probably it is not a very strict one, but in certain airports you go, there is a multi-faith rooms. The Harvard Divinity School, the Center for Study of Religions, they have the all faith room. They call it all faith room, so anyone can go. It's just whitewashed wall, and so this accommodation. So certainly from the studying of the sociology of religion, we are not inventing things, and this can be seen that this kind of a sociological practice or the social custom already existed, and so there is we have to be paying attention and learning more and exploring that how it happened in the past. Now that was an example. Just I lost track of the time, but the next thing that is when we look into the text, how this plays in the text. So first thing that we see that I was very inspired to look into this book that they said that the text or the books are the binding spaces. So they bind things together. So we draw, and then from that drawing, from the text. And from this perspective, when we come, so the linguist has, they have said that, that the Buddhist text, they are not really of high quality of translation. So it is not high enough. But my position is that these texts are the social products. They are social products. And as a material product of the society, so then I will use them that this text, when the people were writing and when they were producing and translating, translation is intercultural communication. It is an intercultural event. So they would translating either from Chinese into Sogdian, or they were translating it from Sanskrit into Sogdian. So decoding different writings, translating from one linguistic domain into the different linguistic domain, and putting it into the text. So we can see that in the text production, all these activities that involves in producing a text is part of that interconfessional space. We don't know whether the texts that were translated, the Buddhist texts that were translated in Sogdian, whether the translators were Buddhist or not Buddhist. We don't know. The similar way that Marshak poses the question that the artist was not Buddhist. So I think that probably the translator may not have been Buddhist, because when we look into the way that they translated and the whole aspect of the syntax and grammar, so we find it that there is a lot of conflicting. However, what we see that in within that perfectly unperfect, literally work, we can still see that the social activity of people, that they have tried to adapt the ideas that were not known to them. They kept it in transliteration. There were the words that they didn't have, and so they borrowed it from Parthian. So the words that they really didn't know what to do with it, they didn't find, so they accepted it from sort of the Prakrit or from the Sanskrit. And then even they have just basically transliterated the Chinese into Sogdian script. So it is in Sogdian, but it is Chinese. And you cannot make a meaning out of it. But still, this means that as cognitive science poses the questions about the mental productivity, and as in space study we talk about the mental space, and as Foucault says that the knowledge generates mental space, and that space that is generated, then it projects itself into a physicality. So here we see that this intellectual process that involved producing this text and brought a whole range of possibility for the people to exercise their cognition in understanding this religion, as well as in presenting this religion. So this was a space that a space to think and a space to produce. At the same time, there is one Buddhist text that has a colophon, which already shows that someone asked that, for the sake of gaining merit, I would like you to produce this text. So we can see that there is also this relationship between the people who copied and people who were motivated to pay and finance such work existed. So altogether, to summarize, so this is, as I said, it is a preliminary, but my main idea is that in applying the methods that were used to study the social customs and habits in 19th and 20th century allows us to apply these methods back, and then to see that there is a lot that we can learn in producing a research that can inform the next generation about living in plurality but in harmony. Thank you.
Our second speaker, I'm very much happy to introduce you, Matthew, knowing your work and great admirer of your work. So Professor Matthew Canepa is Professor of Art History Chair in Art History, Archaeology of Ancient Iran at the University of California, Irvine, where I met you first, I think. And currently Villa Scholar of the Getty Research Institute, Los Angeles, an historian of art, archaeology, and religions. In his research focuses on the interaction of art, ritual, and power in Eastern Mediterranean, Persia, and wider Iranian world. He is a faculty member of the University of California, Irvine Department of History, PhD program in Visual Studies, and affiliated faculty member of the Department of Classics. Professor Canepa is an active contributor to UC Irvine Samuel Jordan Center for Persian Studies and Culture, the North America's premier center for research and teaching in Iranian studies. Thank you so much, Matthew. It's wonderful. And welcome.
Thank you. so much for that very generous introduction. So I hope I can live up to some of that. All right, so let me begin. The presence of Iranian elements in Central Asian visual and ritual cultures has long been noted by historians of art and archaeology, working in a number of fields. These Iranian elements, such as iconographies, deities, or royal ritual, appear for the most part in a manner that departs substantially from comparable material in the Western Iranian plateau. So instead of simply repeating such parallels, this paper seeks to understand the dynamics underlying, motivating, and animating these connections and exchanges. In particular, it explores the variety of roles that Iranian visual cultures played as cross-cultural mediators, and asks to what extent did late antique Persianate visual cultures create a language of legitimacy and debate among Eurasian elites and religions. We investigate the role of the Iranian cultural and political realm in establishing images and ideas that shape the development of late antique and later medieval interconnection. Here, I will characterize and explore multiple different modes of material and visual cultural entanglements between Iran and Central Asia. Some of these are found in Bamiyan and Kazil. However, my talk will extend well beyond these sites. I hope this talk will then provide a broader context for other more specific treatments of these sites that we're going to see in this conference. The main thesis of the talk and the larger project to which it relates and from which it draws posits that the Sasanian Empire created a global visual culture of power and prestige that impacted the late ancient world. And this spread well beyond their own frontiers and artistic and ideological productions. I'll focus first on direct Iranian imperial interventions in the region, and then turn to the role of Iranian cultural and political productions in establishing images, ideas, and infrastructural networks that provided a transcultural idiom of legitimacy and debate. And we're going to consider whether this underpinned and how this underpinned multiple discourses of authority that were used to communicate far beyond the frontiers, both religiously as well as politically. Of the sites that form the focus of our conference, I will deal primarily with Bamiyan and, to a lesser extent, Kazil. Two of the sites that will enter in discussion, in addition to Bamiyan, are those that are within the frontiers of the Sasanian Empire, though Bamiyan itself only temporarily lay within the boundaries of the frontiers of the empire. So here we'll explore two modes of influence. One which was the result of more direct Iranian imperial control, and the other which grew from a more complex process of exchange. And I'll be putting the later South and Central Asian manifestations into context with sites in the Persian homeland, such as Shahpour and Taki Bostan, just by way of example. Bamiyan, in particular, lay at the core of the ancient Iranian lands, as described in the text the Avesta, later the core of the holy book of the Zoroastrian religion. These texts focus primarily on the regions of the Oxus River Valley, the Pamirs and the Hindu Kush. Persia and the western lands of the Iranian plateau are notably absent. It should be noted that Iran becomes a central and official political construct and emic designation only in the Sasanian period, with Ardaghshir's invention of Iran Shah, that is, the empire of the Iranians. Bamiyan, in its caves and mural painting, come at the end of a centuries-long process of Iranian and South Asian entanglements, extending from the Achaemenids through the Seleucids, Greco-Bactrian periods, the Kushans, and Parthian empires. The Sasanians represent both a continuation, but also a new dynamic. To contextualize the direct imperial engagement, let us start from the center of the empire of the Iranians and work outwards. Sasanian cities stood at the center of memorial zones, whose associated features, from rock reliefs to pavilions to bridges to hydraulic works or agricultural installations, all projected the king's presence through their surrounding landscape. In the mountainous Iranian plateau, rock reliefs played an especially important role in constructing regional topographies of power. Carved into the river gorge in the city's edge, Shahpour I's reliefs at Bishapur all define the King of Kings' identity as truly a king of Iran and non-Iran, as he describes it in his inscriptions. And this provides a clear and increasingly iconographically coherent interpretation of the deeper import of his military victories against the Romans and the Kushans. These rock reliefs at Bishapur join those at Naqshi Rostam and Darabgird to constitute a larger body of reliefs in which the king imaged and celebrated his lordship over the lands and peoples beyond the traditional borders of Iran. Following his father's precedent at Ardakhshir Khwara, Shahpour converted the landscape around Bishapur into an environmental victory monument and carved 3 rock reliefs along the river gorge. All reliefs that portray Shahpour's Roman and Kushan victories figurally were executed at sites in the Sasanian homeland in southwestern Iran, so in the core of the empire. Bishapur Relief 3 and Relief 2 extend his dominance over Kushan South Asia as well as the Roman Empire. Although they differ in size and integrate a different number of figures and registers, these reliefs portray the King of Kings receiving the submission of conquered peoples, and show him literally backed up by rows of Sasanian nobles, the great houses. A variation of this theme is also seen in Bishapur 3. And here's a line drawing to make it more legible. This relief expands the composition to include a grand operatic cast of hundreds, with submitting Romans on the bottom and Kushans offering gifts in this central and upper register, including an Indian elephant. So this is just to kind of ground you in the imperial center. Let us now shift our attention to the region around Bamiyan. When the Iranian king marched on non-Iranian lands, he claimed occupied and conquered territories, not only militarily, but symbolically by introducing changes to their ideational landscapes. Rock reliefs were the most enduring mark of a region's inclusion in the empire of the Iranians, permanently marking the space of a newly conquered territory. So after his invasion of the Kushan Empire, the northern portion at least, Shahpour carved a rock relief deep within conquered territory and demonstrated his victory metaphorically with a hunting scene. At the site of Rockybea in present-day Afghanistan, to the north of the Bamiyan Valley, Shahpour carved relief in a cliff that flanked the main north-south route from Balkh to Bagram. And this connected Bactria with the Indian subcontinent. And the relief at once claims the odontic space of this transcontinental trade route and marks the local topography of his new subjects. In addition, as I've explored elsewhere in greater detail, this general region contains several sites that had been important for the former Kushan Empire, like the dynastic sanctuaries at Rabatak and Surkhotal, even if some had fallen out of use by the time the Sasanians invaded. Although the relief is heavily damaged, the subject matter is recognizable, portraying the King of Kings hunting rhinoceroses, an identifiably South Asian beast, subtly alluding to his victories over the Kushans, and implying mastery over a landmass that extends far to the south of this mountainous Bactrian pass. Just as importantly, 3 figures, some of whom wear a stereotyped type of dress marking them as Kushan, are arranged around the king, and the upper portion of the relief also shows the remnants of architecture and foliage, including a mango tree. The composition and subject matter of the relief contrasts with the standard composition of the king's reliefs from Pars, where the 3 defeated Roman emperors are arrayed around the King of Kings, along with what might be a Kushan prince in a static manner. The relief at Rockybea communicates a similar message, using a different compositional and thematic method, showing the King of Kings enjoying the land of India as his personal game park. Just as importantly, instead of submitting foreign rulers, it portrays the elite of the Kushan Empire as now hunting with the king and his Persian retainers. So compared to the Persian reliefs, the message of Rockybea is not as overtly bellicose. While not necessarily accommodating, it can perhaps be interpreted as an image that seeks to integrate his new lands and new elites into the empire. To the remnants of the Kushan kings, the message is, however, aggressive. Your land and resources are now mine, your elites are now my men, and I can enjoy this land like I do my own personal paradise. It's not exactly submit or die, but it's domination, even if sublimated. As Franz Granade noted, the representations of the mango tree seem to draw from earlier conventions for portraying the tree found within the broad repertoire of Kushan period sculpture. While many of the sculptural forms draw from South Asia, the iconographic details of the horse trappings and weapons correspond to Sasanian iconographies from reliefs from Pars. Additionally, according to Granade's study, the relief was created using sculptural techniques that are roughly contemporary and similar to Sasanian ones. It's worth noting that located on the northern side of the Hindu Kush, this region was not within the natural range of either the rhinoceros or mango tree. Instead, they appear to indexically refer to the broader realm of India that lay to the south. So previous scholarship has pointed to the appearance of the rhino hunt in the coinage of Kumaragupta, looking there for parallels. However, this coinage dates several hundred years after Shahpour's relief. And while the Sasanian relief might have responded to a lost tradition of hunt scenes, it is also possible that the imagery on this coin emerged from the introduction and incorporation of the rhino into a longer tradition of Persian hunting scenes in South Asia. These more bellicose messages traveled in small media too, as witnessed by the Paris cameo, and relevant to our discussion of this moment of Indo-Iranian entanglement, a special double dinar issue, which was reportedly found in the lands of the Sasanian North India. Unlike the relief, the coin refers to what Shahpour portrays as the subjection of the Roman Empire as a whole, which was known and whose coinage was even emulated in some instances by the early Kushans. Sasanian coinage was primarily silver, and like later special issues under Khosrow I and Khosrow II, this likely could have been portrayed as gold given in tribute by the Roman emperor. While they draw from the Sasanian triumphal repertoire in different ways, the relief and these objects can perhaps be seen as working together to create a new aristocratic identity based around the King of Kings, and in the case of the portable material, used to convince local elites of the power of the new regime they had thrown their lot in with. The age of Shahpour marks the point of maximum expansion into Central and South Asia for the early empire. The Sasanians lost control of these regions not long after Shahpour's death, and the inroads of the Kedarites and Hephthalite Huns created a new dynamic on their eastern frontier. This began a process of retrenchment, expansion, and contraction that proceeded over the next centuries. The process intensified between the reigns of Yazgird I and Paraz, when the empire came under renewed pressure and Bactria, Sogdiana, and northern India fell from the empire's grasp. Even so, during this period, evidence of the impact of Sasanian royal and aristocratic culture grows in prominence throughout Eurasia. And it is in this later period that the Valley of Bamiyan develops. The valley was on a major transit route, in this case, the east-west route. While the rock-cut Buddhas derive from South Asian traditions of rock-cut architecture and sculpture, they also served a similar purpose as Sasanian reliefs marking Odontic space. The major features of the valley were created largely after the region fell from Sasanian control. And I expect that several others will discuss the primary features of the Buddhist cave complex and the colossal Buddhas in greater detail. Here, I would just like to explore a number of smaller details and processes regarding strategic negotiations of both Iranian divine iconographies and Sasanian royal and aristocratic culture. Compared to Rockybea, we see a much different approach. I want to turn our attention to the mural painting first, that originally crowned the vault of the smaller East Buddha before the Taliban destroyed both in 2001. And this is a mural that we're going to return to later in this conference, and Osman is going to present his own reading of this. Here, I'm really drawing from the work of Granade and presenting this as kind of the standard reading. The mural we're looking at here portrayed a nimmed standing figure in the midst of a rayed mandorla, holding a spear in his right hand, a sword, and the sword hilt in his left. The figure stands on a chariot drawn by 2 horses. This is an image that could be interpretable by viewers familiar with an Indian iconography as a peculiar representation of the sun god Surya. Yet those peculiarities are not necessarily idiosyncrasies. Instead, they relate directly to the iconography of the Iranian Yazata Mithra, Miro in Bactrian, and in Middle Persian Mir. As studied most intensively by Granade, the figure in the Bamiyan mural bears features that correspond to a body of material relating to Mir. And this iconography appears in a small yet cohesive corpus that ranges widely temporally and geographically, from late antiquity with regards to Sasanian seals to the early Middle Ages. In related material, Mir is portrayed either as floating across the sky in a chariot or emerging from a mountain and holding a spear within a mandorla. None of them are identical, yet they share a large number of features in common, more so than they do with the one and only representation of Mir in the Sasanian Empire, that is the rock relief of Ardashir II. While the rayed nimbus and lotus mark this figure as Mir, the figure was adapted to serve within the compositional logic of the relief, the Sasanian relief. In contrast, these representatives of the corpus of Mithraic imagery derive from an iconography that appears to have served different purposes. The seal from the British Museum, up above here, portrays the worshipper in an attitude of prayer, and the archaeological context of the Sogdian murals suggests that these were images that derived from cult images, if not created to serve as the object of venerations themselves. Beyond its placement above the Buddha, the Bamiyan mural was strategically eclectic, blending the iconographies of Indic and Iranian solar and celestial deities. I would argue that this was not haphazard or organically developing, but a process that was intended to deliberately appropriate multiple different iconographies, and by extension, worshippers, just as much as its placement above the Buddha itself. Male figures holding billowing drapery marking them as celestial deities are similar to earlier Kushan period portrayals of the wind god, Avestan Vayu, and Bactrian Awadu. These are accompanied by 3 geese in flight. At his side hovered 2 half-bird, half-human figures holding torches, and these are identifiable as kinaras with those searching for an interpretatio indica, but belonging to a wider repertoire of Eastern Iranian celestial priestly figures appearing in greatest abundance in the Sogdian tombs from Chang'an, such as that of the Sabao Wirkak. Below are 2 winged female figures facing inwards, and they bear the iconographical attributes of Athena, including a pseudo-Corinthian helmet and, with regards to the one on the left, a shield with the Gorgonion. Their defining attributes are those of Athena, yet the figure on the left also bears a bow, which hints at the iconography of the 2 female companions of the Hindu sun god Surya, Usha and Pratyusha, the goddesses of dawn. So this suggests to me that the patrons of the Bamiyan mural deliberately engaged the iconography that was used in veneration among devotees in Eastern Iran. And if Granade is correct in identifying the Bamiyan Valley as the center of the Mithraic cult in Eastern Iran, the local deity, in essence, was converted to be a protector of the Dharma, using a strategy familiar from earlier Bactrian and Gandharian sites, where we see Heracles Vajrapani accompanying the Buddha, as well as in much later Tibetan examples. Just as importantly, such images had the possibility of drawing adherents to Buddhist sites and possibly naturalizing an attitude of veneration towards the Buddhist images. And we're seeing perhaps the appropriation and creative adaptation of Iranian divine iconographies to fashion a visual and spiritual environment that is outward-looking, comprehensively encompassing, and possibly seductive. And this is something that is kind of a parallel yet similar process that I think we have seen in the Manichaean material. In the final portion of this talk, I want to turn to a more complex process of entanglement relating to Iranian royal and aristocratic culture. In particular, it will contextualize the phenomenon of royal iconographies and textile motifs found in both Bamiyan and Kazil. And I offer a methodological reorientation away from simply tracking the transfer of objects and ideas. And my goal is to explore the processes of identity formation which drove their integration and reinterpretation. This is a recent visualization of find sites of objects with a late Sasanian provenance outside the empire, here shaded in rose. This is by no means a comprehensive one, and indeed it leaves out a great deal of material known from the Mediterranean and Europe, but it provides a useful jumping off point. Notice here, when we're looking at it, we're not just looking at an east-west axis stretching from the British Isles to Japan, but an equally vast north-south axis from Siberia and Scandinavia to southern Africa. While the Roman and Turk or Chinese contemporaries might dispute the Iranian courtly vision that presented themselves as the world's pivot, the global impact of Iranian culture is truly impressive. Textual sources such as the Byzantine Book of Ceremonies or the Sui Shu provide evidence of such images, that such objects and images were transmitted by diplomatic gifts. Yet a great deal more moved through processes beyond the control or even knowledge of the cultural and technological point of origin. The Persian royal image spread widely and was selectively incorporated by many rival empires. This was a new image of transcendental, divinely inspired kingship, with elaborate crowns and astral and divine symbols, a nimbus symbolizing the Hwara, or radiant Iranian royal fortune, that inhabited the body of every rightful king, as well as long flowing diadems. We see the impact either directly or subtly from the Mediterranean through Central and South Asia, and traveled in official sealings, silver plate, and of course, coins. When a client king traveled to the court of the Sasanian king, or more approximately the Sasanian kings over the Kushans, they received an insignia of office, including clothing and, most importantly, a diadem that marked their membership in the Persian cultural and courtly sphere. Sasanian court culture soon impacted South and Central Asia with a new wave of Iranian influence. I want to be clear that this isn't the only one the first time, but this is one that is historically specific. Over a period of centuries, the Iranian royal image became supremely important as a locally distinctive, yet at the same time, globally intelligible marker of legitimacy that linked multiple different regions. For example, according to such classical Sanskrit sources, texts as the Burhat Samhita, the Gupta court adopted Iranian regalia and rituals involving the diadem, here called the Patibanda. This was the supreme marker of royal power, and smaller ones were given to courtiers to mark their inclusion in courtly society. And this is the same type of ritual and the same marker that formed a central part of Sasanian court ritual. The Gupta kings retained and then elaborated this tradition to express their kingship in a self-consciously global fashion, and also directly compete with the Sasanians, whose court culture was influential with the Huns and Turkic kingdoms established to the north. None, however, replicated the Persian image directly, but recombined them in a unique manner. Appearing in a different Buddhist cave complex, Ajanta, here notice these figures of a king, servants, and women, all wearing the diadem. Persian styles of dress also came into fashion. And by the 4th century, Indian fashions were supplemented with Iranian-style elements, including trousers, riding kaftans, the diadem, and just as importantly, the hats of the courtiers, the khola, which was, again, a marker of inclusion in courtly society. Kazil distantly participates in this phenomenon too. The donor figures, who were likely intended to be recognizable individuals, proudly displayed the Iranian riding kaftan. While geographically closer to China, culturally, they participate in this wider Eurasian sartorial phenomenon with Iran at its center. And to the historian, but perhaps not always perceptible to those wearing the kaftan. Though those elites who were making these choices, I would argue, were aware of this. With this in mind, we can return to the Bamiyan mural to consider another feature, that is the donor figures in royal dress interspersed with Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. While the image of Mir was oriented to be visible for the viewer standing below, these were oriented to be visible to the viewer standing in the circumambulatory or upper areas. There are multiple hypotheses on the identity and significance of these figures. These range from Keterite or Sasanian rulers to portrayals of the divestment ceremony described by Xuanzang, whereby the local ruler would offer his kingdom to the Buddha. And this is from the later period. This is beyond the scope of this talk here. Rather, I just want to point out that Iranian royal iconographies serve as raw material for portraying both royal and divine power and legitimacy. Nimbuses, diadems, crowns, and frontality can be seen in the Manichaean manuscript illumination too, which we saw in Susanna's talk, though deployed for a similar purpose. Beyond clothing style, at both Bamiyan and Kazil, we find ornamental motifs derived from textiles. They likely were intended to portray the caves as shrouded in expensive silk, or certain architectural elements of them. Beyond these motifs at both sites come into focus as participating in a larger Eurasian conversation that is highly inflected by Iranian royal and aristocratic culture. Functioning on a more elusive register, the Sasanian royal iconographies and iconographies and ritual, textiles and ornaments served an important role in forming, articulating, and transforming the visuality of social and political identities. And I offer just a few examples to illustrate these processes and Eurasian context. The textile on the left, bearing Iranian motifs, comes from Egypt and likely arrived and was used there during the decade of Sasanian rule. It was very likely understood to be Iranian, and an argument can be made that those who wore it connected it with the power emanating from the Iranian court. Local elites also appreciated such textile patterns and commissioned their own textiles with kind of essentially knockoffs made out of wool. The object on the right points to a different set of processes. This is a cut glass Sasanian bowl of the 5th or 6th century that was carefully deposited in the tomb of the Emperor Ankhan, the 27th Emperor of Japan, who ruled from 531 to his death in 536. And this suggests that this bowl entered his collection not too long after its manufacture. The late 5th century tomb 126 at Nara contained numerous Sasanian glass vessels. So was this understood to be Iranian, or did this true import lie in its connection to the court, of the Japanese court? Previous approaches to such objects posit a more or less passive model of diffusion through China. Yet Seth Priestman has recently argued that these and other Iranian finds in Japan are best seen as resulting from direct maritime contact with the Sasanian Empire, rather than passive osmosis. So with this, we're looking at a process of entanglement that manifested through a chain of appropriation and integration. However, it's also possible, in terms of textiles, that a similar direct transmission occurred too. This can be put into dialogue with this textile, the 4 Celestial Guardians brocade held in the Horyuji Temple treasury, and the result of a diplomatic gift on the part of the Chinese court to the Japanese. The textile motifs are traceable to Iranian motifs, yet at this point they had been fully appropriated and redeployed by a third party. I believe we must be attuned to both the new meanings and context, as well as the additional relational meaning stemming from such objects' popularity and mutual intelligibility across multiple cultures. And here, I have to say that Chiara Gasparini's forthcoming book on Sino-Iranian textiles will greatly advance our knowledge in this, and this will be published by University of Hawaii Press in 2019. And she's one of my former PhD students, so forgive the plug there. So what are these textiles doing at Bamiyan and Kazil? So to kind of wrap this up, it might be useful to remind ourselves that this phenomenon was not confined to Central Asia or even East Asia. The 6th century church of San Vitale at Ravenna holds one of the most celebrated representations of the Emperor Justinian, as well as of late Roman textiles. The most important garment in the entire panel is the purple imperial chlamys, which had for centuries been the preeminent symbol of Roman imperial power. However, Justinian's chlamys integrates a panel of silk decorated with birds and roundels, which do not match contemporary Roman silks, but rather this broader archive that we've been drawing from. So alongside its formal functions like framing, filling, linking, or just pleasurably embellishing, ornament could communicate political messages and define identities. And it was one of the most important vocations within this context of elite taste and fashion. Aristocrats and sovereigns interact with foreign ornamental material in order to situate themselves with respect to this larger aristocratic common culture. And no doubt the purpose of the bird roundels in the chlamys served this purpose. Ornaments, often an ornament perceived as exotic, could define a patron as well as a viewer's relationship with an object or structure with respect to their social place and status. And ornament provided a level of illusion and flexibility that the strictly defined genre of imperial regalia or even sacred iconography, that could not. A practice of displaying another culture's ornamental material or even incorporating it into a new context was a tool by which elites could define their identity within their own society as well as the wider global visual culture of power. In this talk, I've explored different modes of Indo-Iranian and Perso-Buddhist entanglement. And we've seen multiple levels of accommodation and strategic integration, from Rockybea's imperial conquest of South Asian space, iconography, and sculptural motifs, and their use as a tool of imperial dominance, to Bamiyan's Buddhist appropriation and strategic integration of Sasanian royal and aristocratic material to communicate the message of the Dharma. This period of cross-cultural interaction dramatically changed the visual cultures of the Mediterranean, Western, Central, and East Asia. And Persian royal iconographies were especially influential. But once integrated into multiple visual cultures, they no longer were perhaps viewed as foreign anymore, but rather Eurasia's common visual idiom of legitimacy and debate. The end result of these Iranian-inflected processes of late antique exchange was to briefly unite the tastes and visual cultures of Eurasia in a way that would not be seen again for many centuries. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. Our next speaker is Dr. Sanjyot Mehendale. It's very difficult to introduce someone who doesn't need an introduction, right? So that's a good way to put it. So all of you know about Sanjyot and about the wonderful work she is doing here, apart from her scholarly work, organizing this conference and also Center for Buddhist Studies and Tang Center for Silk Studies. Apart from that, Dr. Sanjyot Mehendale teaches on Central Asia in the Department of Near Eastern Studies. An archaeologist specialized in cross-cultural connections of early common Euro-Asia. She received her doctorandus, that's Dutch, right? Yes. In the Leiden University in 1977. And she received her PhD degree at the University of California, Berkeley. Martin is here. And with Martin and David Stronach and also Griti Asarpai. Griti is here too, right? So two of the teachers are here to supervise us. I mean, I should not read this, but it has been wonderful. Sanjyot, I know you since long time, and we have been working together in Sri Lanka and also with my colleagues in Uzbekistan, doing a lot of archaeological work. So it's my great pleasure to introduce you and ask you to deliver today's talk. Please welcome her.
All right, thank you, Osman, for that introduction. So for a number of years, too long really, I've been working on a hypothesis regarding the intersection of kingship and Buddhism during the era of Kushan political power in Central and South Asia. So full disclaimer, this paper does not purport to have answers, but instead proposes avenues for cross-disciplinary research. In American football parlance, this is what you call a Hail Mary. So for several hundred years, most prominently from the mid-1st to the mid-3rd century CE, the Kushan ruled parts of Central and South Asia seemingly as divine kings, and are known primarily from what John Rosenfield termed their dynastic art, temples dedicated to the lineage and conquest, and a very diverse corpus of coin issues that proclaimed on the obverse the authority of the king, and on the reverse, perhaps, the divine source of his legitimacy. As seen in this map of sites in Gandhara, the establishment and expansion of Kushan political power also initiated an era that witnessed a significant increase in Buddhist settlements and changes in Buddhism as it rapidly expanded through South and Central Asia. Most notably, these changes included doctrinal shifts and the evolution of a monumental, iconic tradition, in particular the cult of bodhisattvas. While these developments were undoubtedly made possible by the open-door, inclusive environment created by Kushan rule, the question remains as to how active and intent the role of the imperial Kushans was in the spread of Buddhism. Now, before a redirect in more recent scholarship, the most commonly held proposition asserted that in the Kushan period, Buddhism was, quote, carried from India to Central Asia by its devout royal Kushan believers, in particular the ruler Kanishka. The underpinnings of this notion, however, have proven not to be quite as strong as its proponents might wish. While epigraphic remains do support some contribution by Kushan rulers to the establishment of certain Buddhist monuments, there is no hard evidence that they favored Buddhism in particular over the several other religions to be found within their geographically broad empire. On the contrary, the art styles of the Kushan, the art styles and iconography found in Kushan dynastic temples and numismatic evidence seem to point at least to a wide eclecticism and perhaps to a very purposeful syncretism. These dynastic temples include the early temple, the 1st century temple at Khalchayan in modern Uzbekistan, Surkotal in modern Afghanistan, and the temple of Mat near Mathura, India. Khalchayan was a small temple with a column portico leading to a reception hall and cella. It was here in the 1st century CE where the rising dynasty represented its members, victorious from a battle with other clans in Kushano-Parthian, pastoral nomadic, and gender-equal visual idioms, encased in a Hellenized frame which included sculptures of the Dionysian cycle. So here are the friezes, cavalry, the political elites, and the victorious clan. The 2nd century terrace temple in Surkotal, attributed to Kanishka and arranged around a central cella with a peristyle and a courtyard whose niches harbored clay and stone figures, seems to represent a shift from the horizontal portrayal of the clan or group to the representation of the paramount figure of the dynast, a change which may reflect a shift from kinship to kingship. The Rabatak inscription, found not too far from Surkotal, details how the Kushan, in this case Kanishka, saw kingship. The temple itself was not found, but seemed to have been erected on the occasion of either the expansion of territories in India or the consolidation thereof. And it reads, "Of the great salvation, Kanishka the Kushan, the righteous, the just, the autocrat, the god, worthy of worship, who has obtained kingship from Nana and from all the gods, who has inaugurated the year 1. Line 11, gave orders to make images of these gods who are written above, and he gave orders to make them for these kings, for King Kujala Kadphises, his great-grandfather, for King Vima Takhtu, his grandfather, and for King Vima Kadphises, his father, and also for himself. King Kanishka, then as the king of kings, the Devaputra. Finally, in the south, near Mathura, a Devakula, house of gods, where 2 identified statues of kings were found, among others, and images of deities. Carved in the typical red sandstone, they show Kanishka and probably Vimatahtu, represented in the same way or a similar way as Sorkotal, but identified as king in Indic idiom. Maharaja Rajati Raja Devaputro Kanishko, the great king, king of kings, son of the gods, Kanishka. And then here, the great king, king of kings, Devaputra, the scion of the Kushanas, Shahi Vema Takshama. The style of these statues of kings in these dynastic temples is also seen in Kushan portraiture on coins, whose large pantheon included mostly Greco-Roman, Iranic or Iranian, Shaivite iconography with a few depictions of Buddha as well, usually Shakyamuni or Maitreya. With Osmond in the room, I'm not talking about coins at all. So I'm just giving you a picture. In addition to the lack of direct references to Buddhism in Kushan regal art, though some financial contribution toward the establishment of Buddhist monuments came from Kushan kings, most seem to have originated instead from monks and merchants, monks and nuns, from merchants, from local governors and private donors. The reports of Chinese Buddhist pilgrims also are now largely downplayed as somewhat legendary, or at least biased in support of Buddhist settlements and communities along the itinerary, to the virtual exclusion of other non-Buddhist religious traditions. So, in sum, a view of the Kushan Imperium not so much directing as merely accommodating the spread of Buddhism, part of a wider policy of religious and cultural tolerance in support of its expanded hegemony, seems to stand on more solid ground. This having been said, here's my proverbial Hail Mary, that no strong evidence exists for the concerted participation in Buddhist expansion, it may yet be useful to propose a model in which the Kushan political elite did take an active role in the expansion of Buddhism in the region. Now, bear in mind that the reconstruction of the cultural and political patterns of Kushan Central Asia is severely hampered by the lack of available data. Investigation may be warranted of the relationship between Kushan kingship and the creation and support of Buddhist monasteries, and specifically of the function of the Buddhist monastery, of the function of the Buddhist monasteries may have served in the political organization of the Kushan domains. First, it's very important to note that the Kushans had no single center of power within their territories, which stretched from modern Uzbekistan in the north to the Gangetic Valley in India, and even slightly beyond in the south. Rather, the Kushans have either archaeologically or textually been associated with a number of urban centers, such as Begram, Taxila, and other regions. The aforementioned Rabatak inscription in Bactrian, discovered near Sorkotal, attributed to Kanishka, makes note of some of those cities. It reads Saketa, Pataliputra, Kosambi, and Sri Kampa. Since many of these were contemporaneous sites, one is likely dealing not with successive capital cities, but with simultaneous links in a long imperial chain. The fact that there were a number of, quote, capitals, plus the reports of Chinese Buddhist pilgrims such as Xuanzang, seem to indicate that for at least part of each year, the Kushan rulers were itinerant, and their center of power shifting. Given the breadth of empire and the Kushan's nomadic rather than centralized history, such regular travel throughout the empire may well have been necessary in order continually to underline their political and economic alliances. Such peripatetic courts were well known in the ancient Iranian world. The fortification tablets from Persepolis attest to the movement of the Achaemenid king and his court for reasons of state as well as for seasonal changes. In a recent article published in Dan Potts' The Oxford Handbook of Iranian Archaeology, Wouter Henkelman details how the Persian kings not only traveled regularly between their residential settlements at Persepolis, Susa, and Babylon, but also made detours from the official highway or royal road into the interior to connect with their varied subjects to solidify local allegiances through a variety of ritual practices, including gift giving. If one could argue, just like their predecessors, the Achaemenids, and possibly their contemporaries, the Parthians, the Kushans were regularly itinerant, it would be logical to assume that they would have traveled along established routes, most likely those which also witnessed commerce, which connected their capital cities, if you will, and that significant sites along the way provided them not only with food and shelter, but also with the security afforded by political allegiance and legitimacy. That is, given the type of confederate political organization under the Kushans, with its lack of a powerful political and economic center, it would have been necessary for Kushan rulers to maintain several secure bases of support throughout their empire. Beyond the support of local satraps, because I know what some of you are thinking, what role could Buddhist monasteries have played in this type of itinerant kingship? An initial look at the geographic spread of monasteries indicates that aside from those that cluster around specific important Kushan era centers, like Taxila, Peshawar, Begram, perhaps Kapishi, Dalvezin Tepe, and Termez, Begram, Termez, and Dalvezin Tepe, they were primarily located along trade routes or along communication networks, following the Uttarapata, if you will, to Gandhara, then through the Khyber into the Jalalabad region, the modern Jalalabad region, the Kabul area, Begram, through the Salang Pass into Bactria. So these trade routes throughout the Kushan Empire would probably have sat on the path of the traveling king. In such case, the monasteries could have provided immediate economic basis, i.e. shelter, food, supplies for the Kushan rulers. Moreover, since Buddhism had gained significantly in popularity during the Kushan period, in particular in Gandhara, the monasteries may have served the Kushan kings as centers of political support in return for royal patronage. Finally, the monasteries may have provided Kushan kingship with a religious sanctity, which perhaps gave the Kushans, at least in those areas where Buddhism had taken strong hold, some of the connective ideological tissue it required to rule over such diverse territories. I'll speak more on this in a minute. A model arguably analogous to the one just sketched, itinerant kingship relying on royal monasteries to help govern an extensive empire, has been posed by John Bernard in a study of the relationship between the Ottonian and Salian monarchs and the royal churches within their empire. Bearing in mind the obvious contextual problems raised by a comparison of two geographically and temporally widely separated kingship patterns, it is still possible to consider Bernard's several interesting conclusions. Since kingship during 10th and 11th century Germany had no geographic center or central bureaucratic structure, royal monasteries and churches became the most important basis for the accommodation of the king and his following. In doing so, they also provided venues for liturgical representation of sacral kingship, and thereby played an important role in support of the monarchy. Like their Buddhist counterparts during the Kushan period, these monasteries were also located along regular trading routes, usually within a day's march from some other halting point. In order to supply an economic base for royal power, these monasteries were granted large estates. In some instances, entire counties were administered by monasteries and churches. In addition, these German monasteries and churches were granted the right to collect tolls, to hold markets, and to even mint coins. Summarizing his findings, Bernard asserts, in regard, quote, and I quote, in regard to these foundations, one can perhaps see a concerted effort by the German monarchs to use royal protection and patronage to gain and secure new centers of support, allied to the realm and located on important roads in the Saxon heartlands, although they, the kings, did not directly control the revenues from the income-producing rights granted to convents and monasteries, they established the principle that such rights derived from the king. They created personal bonds of patronage, and they could expect to receive or to reap the benefits either materially in the form of their servitium or hospitality when present, or politically in the form of greater loyalty. So like Christianity, Buddhism has always been intertwined with temporal power, as seen from its appropriation, reformulation, deployment of concepts such as Dharma Raja, where the king acts as protector and patron of Buddhism, Chakravartin Raja, the wheel-turning king or divine universal ruler like perhaps Ashoka, and Deva Raja, the deified king who functions sometimes as a bodhisattva. As it seems reasonable to assume that Buddhism would have tried to court royal support during the Kushan era, or at least pretended that they were functioning under its auspices. But vice versa, it's not so clear, and as of yet, not enough concrete information exists that Buddhist monasteries and cultic sites played a role in Kushan kingship. To achieve a better view of the relationship between the Kushan kings and Buddhist monasteries under the model proposed here, several matters would need to be investigated in greater depth. Beyond the mere mapping of the location of monastic settlements, which has been conducted more in earnest over the last decade, a re-evaluation of the archaeological remains of each site might address several significant questions. Were the monasteries large enough to provide for king and retinue? Can one associate any of the finds more with kingship than with religion? Or some significant combination of the two? And did the monasteries have landed wealth which may have been able to provide Kushan kingship with more than incidental economic support? The biggest problem in answering these questions lies not merely with the lack of available data in situ, but the way in which we have largely approached the study of Buddhist monuments in the Kushan period, primarily from the perspective of Buddhist textual and ritual traditions. In other words, we can't find it when we're not looking for it. In fact, there's significant pieces of evidence in support of Kushan Buddhist royal entanglement, if you will. The most studied, of course, are the Buddha coin, the Kanishka reliquary and stupa, and Xuanzang's stories about the Buddhist king of the Kushans, which are actually or usually dismissed as incidental, right? Just too few pieces. But beyond these, there's more evidence, which taken individually might seem innocuous, but collectively may begin to redirect the way we view and study these remains. In the late 1960s, a Buddhist sanctuary, DT1, was excavated to the north of the remains of the Kushan-era city at Dalbasing Tepe in modern-day Uzbekistan. Falling outside of the Kushan's South Asian regions, it's rarely addressed when analyzing Kushan kingship. It consisted of a stupa, of which nothing remained, but a rectangular base, surrounded on three sides by elongated premises. The, quote, Hall of Idols, and these are labels from the excavators, where the entrance was, and a Hall of Kings on the western side. The former harboring clay stucco statues representing Buddha, bodhisattvas, monks, and adherents, the latter statues of the Buddha and sovereigns and kings accompanied by members of their family. Fragments of 3 royal male figures were discovered, as well as a number of female figures of the lineage, dressed in their typical nomadic costume, carrying the applique of the Yueja Saka burials in Tilya Tepe. They were found flanking the Buddha. It is in this northern region, bordering Sogdiana, that one finds the strongest visual links between Kushan political elites and Buddhism. The aforementioned northern center of Termes, Tarmita, included a number of Buddhist complexes, such as the freestanding and cave temples at the Karatepa hillside, and a monastery at Fayastepe. The latter included painted images of Kushan kings. It is here, in this area, that the Kushans positioned themselves vis-a-vis the Buddha as they did with Nana and the Iranic gods at Surkotal. Here they are promoting Buddhism, seemingly in an Iranic context. South of the Hindu Kush, in the greater Gandhara region, there are no regal temples dedicated to the lineage, and it's not clear whether they ever existed. But here too, there are signs that the Kushan tried to attach themselves to Buddhism. The Kanishka stupa and reliquary are, of course, the most concrete example, and most of Xuanzang's references of Kanishka concern his efforts in this geographical sphere. So if no dynastic images of kings exist beyond the coins and the incidental reliefs, are there other indicators of a Kushan Buddhist entanglement? Here, perhaps, a re-examination of Buddhist sites would help illuminate the issue. To give an example, the site of Chotorak, located 4 kilometers from the Kushan era city of Begram, excavated in the 1930s by the Dafa, and sometimes identified as the site where, according to Xuanzang, Kanishka held his hostages, boasts nothing at first glance that would suggest it a royal site. However, as was proposed very early on already by Benjamin Rowland, it does have a rather large pictorial programs that includes multitudes of representations of Kushan donors in Kushan garb, includes a number of reliefs of, for example, the miracle at Sravasti, and also depictions of the Dipankara Buddha, Dipankara Jataka, where the Buddha is depicted as having flames shooting out of his shoulders, emulating what you clearly see on the coins of the Kushan king Kanishka. There's also a royal seat, a chaise, a lion throne, right in the middle of the courtyard, which when Meunier excavated it, he wasn't quite sure what the purpose was. It wasn't as a platform for a statue. That seems to be clear. Who was seated there? And this becomes very, very interesting, of course, because the throne in question is very analogous, right, to the throne of Vimataktu in Mat, as well as a throne depicted on a medallion from Kampir Tepe, which is also in the Termez area. Further, there are numerous images. Madhavanti Ghosh describes them, of Nana seated on a royal lion throne. And given that Nana was one of the premier sort of deities of legitimacy in the period, one starts to see a connection. If in Bactria the Kushans sought to insert Buddhism into an Iranic context, then here one might argue the Kushans practice Iranian sacral kingship, perhaps in a Buddhist context, and become, the proverbial Dharmarajas. It would have been, so to sum up, it would have been politically expedient to court Buddhism, in particular when keeping in mind the distinct nature of Kushan dominions. We talk about them as a monolith, but they are not. Unlike their contemporaries, the Satavahanas in the south, who were embedded in a more uniform Indic environment, the Kushans sought to assert their power over at least 3 culturally distinct territories. Bactria, here, Gandhara in the middle, and then the Indic environment to the south. Their attempts to connect their rapidly expanding empire to its various constituents is evidence in the monumental and numismatic remains. So if it could be proven that Buddhism functioned as a kind of glue of empire, and it could be proven by revisiting the archaeology that royal monasteries existed, then one ultimately might tiptoe into examining one of the early theories about the Bodhisattva figures. And here I quote, sorry, I forgot the last one. Here I quote Rowland, because Benjamin Rowland and Giovanni Verardi were the first ones who sort of speculate about this. We could revisit a theory that, and I'll just give you a quote. Certainly, Khalchayan is not without its importance for the beginnings of Buddhist sculpture in Gandhara. For example, the heads of the young princes of Khalchayan, in their radiant virility, suggest some of the earlier Gandhara Bodhisattvas, which on other occasions I propose might be portrayals of royal local nobles deified in the likeness of members of the Buddhist pantheon. So it's clear, that this is just a working hypothesis, and much work would need to be done in order to explore the nature of this relationship between the kings and the religious orders much more carefully. So what I've tried to suggest is one model that may provide the basis for looking at this issue again. A model that suggests that Buddhist monasteries of the Kushan Empire might not have functioned merely as passive recipients of royal Kushan largesse, but instead might have actively participated in ensuring the political and economic stability of Kushan imperial power. Thank you very much.